Hey, you know what? Believe it or not, there's actually a few new MMOs scheduled to release in 2025, which is quite surprising. I'm currently working on a video going over the full entire list, and yeah, it's a tad lengthier than I was anticipating. But in the meantime, there is one game in particular that I want to talk about here today, and that is ArcheAge Chronicles. This is shaping up to be one of my most anticipated upcoming MMOs. The brief glimpses of gameplay that we've seen thus far, they look pretty good. Though to be fair, there's only been 2 trailers really, which beyond being carefully curated, obviously, because they're trailers only tell you so much, you know, even if they weren't carefully curated. Really, the main reason I'm so excited isn't the gameplay footage that we've seen so far, but rather it's the fact that this is the sequel to ArcheAge, which let me just tell you, as someone who played the 2014 alpha and beta obsessively for months on end, there was a lot to love about this game. I mean, ArcheAge was genuinely, if you didn't play it, let me tell you, it was absolutely an exceptional MMO. Here are some of the reasons why. So it has a big seamless open world. A lot of MMOs have that. It's got all the expected biomes. You got the fantasy points of interest with dungeons and ruins and all of that stuff. You got forest, you got caves, you got everything, right? There were multiple continents with a western, eastern, and northern landmasses to explore, and connecting them all, and this is really one of the big kickers here, is this massive ocean that you can fully traverse. The whole thing, it's just like one big seamless open space. You got player-built ships. You can go out onto the sea, but you'll be making this trek at your own peril because there's a lot of dangers. First, you have to avoid other players who happen to join the PK faction of pirates, literally a third faction in the game of people devoted to killing everyone else on the other 2 main factions. Or nearly as bad was the fact that roaming the seas was this massive kraken capable of one-shotting you and your vessel. And yes, this entire play space 100% seamless. Every corner of the terrain could be navigated. You could start at the far end of the eastern landmass all the way at the bottom and then make your trek across all of those zones, going through the various mountains, valleys, through the forest, making your way eventually to the shore, and then get in your boat and sail across the ocean to the other continent all the way on the west, and then traverse through there, and then maybe you go out the northern side and you sail up to the northern continent. I mean, it's a whole big one seamless play space without any loading screens in between to break immersion, which is really, really wholly welcome. It's not the only game to have ever done it, but they did a good job at delivering that vision of like a unified play space that you're never pulled out of through loading screens. Also, playing a direct role in here is that the game had a lot of different traversal options. You had a glider, and this played a huge role in exploration and world traversal, and frankly, I prefer this sort of system over outright unrestricted flight in MMOs, as it gives you the chance to find shortcuts and interesting ways to go around the play space without trivializing the entire world, as you being able to fly over all of the dangers. I mean, the game even had aerial combat from your gliders, where you could shoot straight ahead or drop explosives beneath you, which just added a whole other layer to it. There was also, as mentioned, a boat. You could craft your very own boat. There were multiple classes with different strengths and speeds and offensive capabilities, and this whole naval element with the naval combat also had added a entirely new dimension. They also had regular mounts that you could ride around on, different mounts with different bonuses. There were some that were travel focused, that were faster. There were ones that had combat abilities to help you killing NPCs or other players, and there were ones that could help you carry around heavy objects. And the landscape itself was entirely traversable. They even had elements of like climbable things like ladders that could take you up to higher levels of buildings, or there'd be vines on the sides of mountains that you could use to scale up and get to a higher level, and then use your glider to get around, but again, without that unrestricted flight. It was just really, it was an interesting space to explore. Trade pack runs also play a big role into this whole experience. So the fundamentals of these is that running trade packs were a good way to make money. So what would happen is you would craft a valuable item, and there were certain items that could only be crafted in particular zones. And then that will turn into this trade pack that you put on your back, and it's heavy, so it slows down your base movement speed rather substantially. And you would offset that slowing by doing different things. You could hop on something like a donkey mount, which wasn't as fast as the speedy mounts, but it was better than the walking speed with the trade pack. You can make your way to the coast and then get in a boat, as aforementioned. You could also take things like public caravans that would move around the zones from major city to major city. There were things like air vehicles, like zeppelins as well, that you could hop in. And then the whole idea here is that you would craft a trade pack in one zone, and the further you took it from its origin to turn it into another major or town in another zone, the further away it goes, the more money you make. So if you like, say you make bananas in one zone and you carry it to the other zone, you'd make maybe like 10 currency. But if you carry it across the ocean, you can maybe make 1,000. Those aren't the exact conversions, but just an idea. But the problem is, the longer you're carrying this trade pack, the more opportunities there are for people to mess with you. Enter PvP. The game had loads of PvP, even same faction PvP as well. So there are two primary factions in the game, and you would essentially be in a constant battle with them. Not 100% constant, but how it worked was the game would have, you'd have these open zones, right? And around halfway through the leveling process, once you got to like the 30s or so, you would eventually enter these contested zones. And how these worked is they would have two potential states, either at peace or in war, and they fluctuate between them every few hours throughout the day. And when a zone was in war, it becomes open, no holds barred, full PvP between you and the enemy faction. But beyond that, at any time, anyone on your own faction could also flag for a PvP and attack you, which aside from doing it just for the fun of it and for the lulz, players would also want to do this to do things like, for example, steal some of the highly valuable trade packs that you might be happening to carry. But that, attacking your own faction, was technically illegal. Enter the game's crime system. So they had this whole crime and trial system built into the game. If you committed a crime, which would be doing something like flagging and killing your own faction, or maybe you steal somebody's crops out in the wilderness, either of these things were considered a crime and would leave behind evidence. In particular, they would be footprints if you stole someone's crops, or blood pools if you killed someone from your own faction. And if another player happened to walk by and find that evidence, they could click on it and report the crime, which would then increase your criminal ranking. And if that reached a certain point, you would then automatically get thrown in jail. And then from there, you would have to go through a trial system where your own peers would review your case. They would look at the evidence, look at what you did, basically like the combat log or the event log of what transpired to get you thrown in jail. And then they would decide how severe your punishment should be, how long you should be locked in there, basically. It was really, really, really interesting. Combat in the game, it was a traditional tab target system, although they did have a bit of a twist with this whole system of combos and spell synergies, where if like certain conditions were met, like for example, if your opponent had a particular debuff, then the ability that you're casting would get some bonus effects triggering the combo. So for example, there might be ranged attacks that would deal bonus damage if your target was bleeding, or maybe there's a CC ability that will slow your target, but if the target is already slowed, it would then trip them or stun them, basically locking them down. And there was tons of interesting interactions between abilities and debuffs that you apply beforehand, which would sort of help you determine how you wanted to craft your build and make your class. And speaking of class, they had a rather interesting class system where how the whole thing worked is you would pick from multiple trees, and every tree was essentially themed after like a traditional RPG role and play style with skills that corresponded to that. So there's like a tanky tree, a melee brawler tree, a stealth rogue tree, a ranger tree, a healer tree, a support tree, a cursing tree, etc. So you pick the three that you want, and then that combination of the three, depending on what you pick and what order you pick them in, that determines your class. The game actually had over 220 potential combinations, or 220 actually named classes to choose from. So one class that I played was the Dark Runner, and this combined Battle Rage, which is like a melee focused heavy damage in your face brawler, Shadow Play, which is stealthy with things like Shadow Step and invisibility, and then Auramancy, which was just like a utility tree. It had a lot of useful things, including various buffs and debuffs and the ability to blink. And so this was a melee focused class who could go stealth, do bonus damage from stealth, had heavy burst of damage, and then a ton of utility and CC, again, mostly via that Auramancy tree. And again, there were so 220 potential combinations that you could come up with. And now the game did have a rather theme parky leveling and questing system, but there was also a ton of sandbox elements in this game, like the fact that you could plant trees, herbs, veggies, literally anywhere in the environment. You could take the seeds, you could put them in the ground, and if you water them and enough time passes, they eventually grow into the full grown iteration of whatever the object is. Like you could just plant a forest of palm trees anywhere in the environment if you wanted to. Really, really cool. Great sandbox stuff. They also had non-instance player housing, so most of the zones in the game would have areas where you could claim a plot of land and then place down your own home. You claim the plot, you gather the stone and the wood required, you place the house blueprint, and then you deposit those materials. In the process, there's your house, and then you can further customize it. You can put down your own workstations and little doodads. You can even place farming plots, as the game did have a big emphasis on farming and growing your own crops that you would use for other aspects of the game. And all of this just out in the open in those areas of the zones where other players could walk by. I mean, you'd basically have player towns that people would walk through, and they could check out your house and look at your crops and all sorts of stuff. But then beyond the stuff that you own, that you pay taxes for and you have exclusive rights to, there was also this whole system of running illegal farms, where basically you would plant a load of highly valuable crops, whatever those happen to be. Let's just say they're banana trees. You would like find a spot up in the mountains to plant a bunch of banana trees, but then you'd have to water them and tend to them until they grow, and that takes actual real world time. And the idea was, without having to pay for or be restricted to your limited plot of land that you have claimed, you could make potentially as much as possible, but they weren't claimed, so they were out in the wilderness, and technically anyone could come along and steal them and destroy them and do whatever. Now, that would then also play back into the crime system, where if somebody does steal your stuff, you would get the footprints of evidence, and if you got there in time before those footprints expired, you could report them, and then they'd go through the crime system and potentially get thrown in jail. It was just all so cool, dude. And on top of that, the game just had like a ton of extra additional little things that added a lot of charm to it. Great ambiance in the game, absolutely fantastic music, really good lighting and set pieces, a lot of downtime activities, some of which we've mentioned here. You could play instruments in the game to restore health and mana, and these songs would heal in a radius around you. So in dungeons, for example, you'd often see players like grouped together playing their little instruments. You'd have like a guitar, a violin, a flute, a trombone, whatever, and you'd be playing this song while also replenishing yourself. Again, just like little layers of things for charms. They had the whole farming and raising animal system, the sailing the seas, the PvP combat, the crime system. Just really, really great game. Literally, ArcheAge was one of the best, most fun, immersive and engaging sandbox MMOs I've ever played. But unfortunately, it also ended up completely destroyed and hamstrung by poor decisions, as they chose at launch to release the game with very aggressive monetization and straight up clear as day pay to win, which basically killed ArcheAge on the spot. ArcheAge was its best self before the cash shop was in the game, and when it was its best self, it was something. I played the alpha and beta obsessively. It was just so good, but when the game officially released, they just totally ruined it. And two of the main issues that I recall were, one, them selling these labor point potions, which meant that you could pay money to refill your labor bar once every 4 hours, letting you do significantly more harvesting and crafting than other players. And this was a game where all of the best stuff, all of it, all the best gear and items came from crafting. There were drops in the world and dungeon items, but those were many tiers below the strength of the highest tier best crafted items. So buying labor point potions just directly meant that you could craft more often, you could lever your crafting quicker, and you could get the best gear way faster than players not paying. And the other thing that really sucked was that one of the primary resources needed to craft a lot of the high-end items was called Archeum, and there were just very few in-game acquisition methods at release. But you could buy some Archeum straight up in the cash shop. What are the odds, right? So yeah, there were more microtransaction and cash shop related issues. I know there was like a premium sub, which gave you significantly more stuff, but that's not even the worst. This stuff was just really, really bad. Those are the two big ones that I recall really ruining the experience at launch. Now that said, as mentioned prior, there was a base game there that was phenomenal. So many great systems and features, and just an incredibly immersive play space and world with a ton of charm to it. It's just the cash shop. If that didn't exist, ArcheAge easily becomes like a top 5 MMOs of all time for me, legitimately. So enter ArcheAge Chronicles. Let's talk about that. What do we know about this game? Well, for starters, one interesting note is that when it was first revealed back in 2020, the game was originally called ArcheAge 2, like a proper sequel. But then a few months ago, they released this update with a couple new trailers and dev blogs and a big press blast with a brand new name, now called ArcheAge Chronicles. Now, this rebrand seems inspired by a desire for them to reach a wider audience. Along with the new trailer, we got a developer diary. This shared some insights. Let's go into it. So straight at the top, they mentioned the shift to action combat over the prior game's tab targeting system. They discuss how this comes with its own set of challenges, however, in the MMO space, mainly networking issues. And of course here, they're really talking about things like desync and server lag, which often can be more prevalent in these action combat MMOs. This is mainly because action combat games have more precise hitboxes and combat with calculating attacks from and against the enemies in more precise manners, while also having to consider a large number of players around you. As such, there's just a lot of back and forth communication between the player and then the game server and then all the surrounding players back and forth for every single action, every single step, every single spell cast, and every single attack. And any little hiccups in that process as the data passes from you, the player, to the servers, to all the other players around you, back to the servers, and then back to you. If there is any issue in that process, that equals the desync and lagging that you tend to see in action combat MMOs. Tab targeting has means to alleviate those issues with various forms of latency compensation that makes it a lot less noticeable to players when there's a large number of other players around or a large number of NPCs around as well. That just becomes less of a problem. That's part of why tab targeting was first implemented in the first place in the early days of MMOs when internet connections were way, way worse. Now, with that in mind, they have stated that their goal here is to deliver action combat that rivals that of single player titles. And I just assume here that they're directly talking about like the game's responsiveness, overall feel, and trying to make sure there isn't a lot of server issues of desync and server lag. They also directly refer to ArcheAge Chronicles as an MMORPG with, quote, a well-crafted world full of adventures and world bosses to take on. Keep this MMORPG reference in mind for a little later here. They touched on PvP in the dev blog, saying that people often expect large-scale battles and competitions from an MMORPG, which are indeed important. However, we also believe cooperative content and adventure stories where players become the protagonists could attract a broader audience. They're not wrong that many of the most successful MMOs have elements that will appeal to solo players and or the PvE-focused crowd, but I do certainly hope they don't abandon the PvP side of things, and it doesn't sound like they're going to. They allude to it later on here. Then later on, they say that they are prioritizing the PvE aspects of ArcheAge Chronicles as they believe that engaging with a variety of monsters enhances the game appeal, but that doesn't mean that the game won't have PvP. Rather, we believe that if the monsters and combat mechanics are interesting, the PvP experiences will naturally be enjoyable as well. Don't quite understand that last sentence. If the PvE combat against monsters and those mechanics are interesting, the PvP becomes more enjoyable. Maybe they're just referencing the combat side of things, where like if our combat is engaging against monsters, it'll also be engaging against other players. Maybe, I don't know. Probably what gives me the most hope though is their next line here, where they say, many players fondly remember ArcheAge, so we are incorporating its popular elements into the new game and enhancing them. For instance, trading, housing, and farming will be more enjoyable. I assume by more enjoyable, they just mean more fleshed out, more interesting, more diverse, whatever. Outside of that, I'm also hoping they deliver some of the other things that made the original ArcheAge so good, like that fully seamless explore everywhere open world, even across the seas from landmass to landmass, the variety of traversal options with the gliders, the boats, and the various forms of scalable terrain, letting you pretty much go anywhere, and not just trading, but also the trade pack runs, which has been confirmed. And if not as an emphasis, I do pray there's at least some form of open PvP, even if it's in a select few zones towards the later end of the game and not mandatory. I also still want to see the crime and trial system, the interesting class system with all the various potential combinations, and of course, above all, they can still keep a theme park core, but have a lot of those sandbox things that the first game had as well. And finally, they also in this video directly addressed the rebranding by saying, ArcheAge Chronicles isn't just a sequel to ArcheAge. Recreating ArcheAge to resonate with contemporary audiences was crucial as well. We aim to infuse the game with new elements suitable for a new era and needed a title that reflected this shift. Part of that newness is also the more story focus and the fact that they're shifting from tab target to action combat. I think it's worth noting as well here that this game will be launching on both PC and consoles. And I mean, it's fair to say that they are likely to reach more of the console market with what feels like a new game over what is a sequel that the console player base never got to play and may have never even heard of. Like, yeah, I'm sure ArcheAge Chronicles sells more copies on PS5 than ArcheAge 2 does, just like marketing alone. And to that point, point, around the same time that they released this new trailer and this dev blog, they also released an article on the PlayStation blog, and this too came with some noteworthy information. So the blog itself was written by the executive producer of ArcheAge Chronicles, and he opened it by saying, first and foremost, we're excited to introduce the next installment in the ArcheAge series, ArcheAge Chronicles. As an online action RPG, ArcheAge Chronicles promises to deliver a more immersive experience with a strong emphasis on action combat. The game will feature epic large-scale raids and cooperative play, offering a diverse array of activities for players to enjoy. As for other details, in his posting on the PlayStation blog, we learned that the game will emphasize exploration and life skills, ensuring there is always something new to discover and new skills to master. Housing is going to be a cornerstone feature, enabling players to build and customize their own homes. However, they're transitioning from the previous open world model, with ArcheAge Chronicles featuring dedicated housing zones where players can showcase their creativity and achievements. I do understand for technical reasons why they might have made this decision, but unfortunately, I just think instance player housing is way less interesting in terms of like the game play space and feeling as like part of a community and getting to see other players' houses without having to be invited into them, like party up and then let you port to their instance of the housing area. Now, there is going to also be larger scale housing, and I'm just curious, like they talked about communities building entire towns, and I wonder if like you will have instance personal housing, but the community housing will be out in the public. That's something that I think still hasn't been answered. He goes on to say there's a rich variety of life skills with farming, crafting, and trading, providing numerous ways to engage with the game world and economy. And then finally, it talks about the action combat system that's going to allow for combos with elemental attacks and clever defensive tactics, but also discussing how team play, there's some group synergy here as well. He says, with a team of 10 or more players, you'll unleash even greater synergy, mastering chain skills in sync with your team to take down the most formidable raid bosses. Seems like some collaborative things where there'll be like windows of opportunities where players can merge their skills using two synchronizing skills together for increased enhanced effects, sort of like an additional layer to the combo system that the original game had. One interesting thing to point out from this PlayStation blog, though, is that at no point in the several paragraphs do they ever call this game an MMO, instead referring to it as an online action RPG, even though the official dev blogs as well as the Steam page do call the game an MMO. Why the inconsistency here? Well, I think if anything, it's just them trying to target, again, that console audience, right? It seems like there's, especially nowadays over the past few years, there's been a real aversion to calling these games that are otherwise known as MMOs in the PC sphere, calling them MMOs in the console sphere. We saw this happen with New World when they ported to console with Eternum. They just refused to call it an MMO, even though it's referred to being an MMO everywhere else. So yeah, I think this is just like a branding and marketing thing, which is odd, but whatever. The game's Steam page also gives a few new details here. So let's say that in the combat section, they say we'll choose from a variety of weapons and skills to create our own unique build. I'm really hoping they go with that combination thing where picking different skill trees to form your class from the original game. We'll see. They say we'll explore a wide range of combat styles, including melee, ranged, and magic. Yeah, of course. And most interestingly is they say you'll engage dynamically as you jump, fall, roll, dash, block, and parry. And that is like the full suite of single player action combat RPG games. Like they're even most action MMOs don't have all of those layers of contextual elements. Like take BDO, for example, though. It's mostly just like you use defensive and mobility skills, and then your offensive abilities are just AoEs and cleaving. There's no parries and like counterattacks as such. So yeah, it seems like they're going like, as mentioned previously, they're going to like replicate the single player action RPG experience, but in an MMO space. Having parries in your MMO with the difficulties of certain, like, it'll be interesting to see if they can pull that off and not just end up with a bunch of terrible desync like all the time and rubber banding, right? We'll see. And then in the feature section, they say life skills are going to include gathering, housing, farming, crafting, and hunting, which I don't think hunting was in the original game. At least I don't remember ever doing it. And they also say we're going to explore the open world with unparalleled freedom, embarking on trade runs, so confirming that trade runs are going to be a thing in the game. Fighting alongside comrades to defend your routes from dangerous enemies. Ideally, those dangerous enemies will include other players if the PvP makes its way into this element. Oh, and then also, unlike in the PlayStation blog, on the Steam page, yes, they do directly refer to the game as an MMORPG. We got a letter from the producer. A couple of things from this. He said that players can look forward to epic raids, rich party gameplay, and countless ways to engage with the vibrant world. So pretty much confirming we're going to be be getting raids in the game. And for PvP, he says that we've prepared a fresh take on the ArcheAge universe by shifting from the large-scale competitive battles to smaller group activities and interactive adventures. And this, to me, leads me to believe they're going to be doing something akin to battlegrounds or arenas, instanced ways to have competitive PvP versus the big open world PvP or wars. Okay, so that is pretty much everything that I could scrounge together, all of the details and info that we know thus far about ArcheAge Chronicles. Safe to assume we're going to be getting a lot more information as the year progresses here, and if any big chunks of new details come out, I'm definitely going to make another video because, like I said at the very beginning, this is one of my most anticipated MMOs. And it hadn't registered to me until like doing this research for this video, how close we actually are to getting the sequel to ArcheAge. Like, man, my pie in the sky dream for this game is that they take all of the best parts of the original, everything that I spent the first half of this video gushing over, while not repeating the same mistakes that they made with monetization at release. Because if they can do that, man, and if they can actually deliver on the action combat and not have issues with desync and rubber banding and all this latency problems, if they can do that, we might be in for a real treat here, frankly. I feel like ArcheAge is one of those games where everyone I know who plays it just adored it, but a lot of people didn't ever get around to playing it. And I think part of the reason is because when it actually did officially launch publicly, it had a horrible reception because of how much they botched like getting over the finish line there with their choices, with their monetization choices. Now, what are the odds that they don't have similarly bad and aggressive monetization? Probably not great. Like, I would assume, if anything, frankly, if I had to make an educated guess, it's probably going to be worse. That would be my guess. That's at least been the general trend for MMOs, especially Eastern developed MMOs over these past 10 years. Feels like things have just been getting progressively worse with how they monetize and how many levels of monetization and all the layers. You got the alternative forms of subscriptions. You've got with the monthly thing that gives you various perks, right? Which the first ArcheAge had. You got the seasonal pass model now, and then you got all of the cash shops with all the convenience features for sale, barring whether or not they decide to do cosmetics as well. They'll probably sell pets and garbage like that too, which, you know, it's not my whatever. It's fine, but I feel like that also breaks part of the immersion of these games. But regardless, man, I will remain hopeful until they let me down. That's just how I operate. So we'll see. ArcheAge Chronicles, keeping my fingers crossed, but I'm not doing it so hard that I break my fingers. Kind of weird. Okay. That's it for today. Thank you as always for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you think. Let me know, is it just already doomed? Is that, are we going with that? I mean, maybe it is, but I'm hoping to at least, I'm hoping that they at least have enough of an interesting base game that replicates everything that made the original ArcheAge great, but in a modern day, prettier package with the action combat on top of it to boot. If they can deliver those systems with a big seamless open world and have all of those great things, but get like a new iteration of it for today, man, I'll play that for at least a month, even if the monetization blows, like, honestly. So we'll see what happens, but that's it for this video. I'll keep you posted if we get new details. Thanks for watching. See y'all next time. Take it easy.